create a more progressive farm bill. Empower the self-determination of rural people. Empower the self-determination of rural people. Number 2, transform social and institutional structures to become more egalitarian. Transform the social and economic structures that create greater equality among people, equality of opportunity. Number 3, challenge the dominance of unaccountable organizations and individuals. Challenge the dominance of unaccountable people who have control over our social and economic systems. And number 4, forge new paths for greater participation of all people in a democratic system. At their very best, all farm violence, rebellion, and other rabble-rousing has been around these 4 principles. So to be sure, these are general goals, and the organizations, movements that have emerged from these, including the KFU and the NFU, have not been fully successful. However, their efforts have been hampered by larger contradictions in the United States history and society, leading to polarization over numerous things that we're very familiar with today, and which you're not surprised to learn have their roots in historical events going back hundreds of years, including class, race, gender, regionalism. Still, and I want to underline this, rural movements have often been at the center of the struggle for more, not less, democracy. And this is your strength. My question for you is, are those principles, whole or in part, still the central thread of rural protest today? And I'm going to try and answer that a little bit. Okay, early examples, I'm going to give you some quick examples of why this is consistent through time. And it sounds like a lecture, I'm sorry. Early examples of farm movements, my favorite one is the Tobacco Rebellion. Anybody remember that from university, high school, the Tobacco Rebellion? So this is colonial America, it's before the Constitution, and it's when no one in Europe had started smoking or chewing yet, and when they found out about it, they couldn't get enough of it, and tobacco prices went sky high. And as a result, those early tobacco farmers, we're talking long before the 1700s, those early tobacco farmers decided they would do what you would do. They planted everything they had in tobacco. They planted it in the fields, they planted it along fence rows, they planted it in land they didn't own, they planted it in the front yard, they planted it in window boxes. Everywhere, right up to the edge of their buildings and homes and farms, they completely inundated the Virginia countryside with tobacco. And what do you suppose happened? The price dropped. It went from 55 cents a pound to 6. And do you know who got upset about that? The big landowners. The ones who owned tens of thousands of acres. They didn't even have slaves yet. The ones that had tens of thousands of acres of tobacco and were counting on that crop, angry at the smaller farmers. And what did they do? They went in and they tore up those smaller farmers' tobacco plants. Physically, tore them up. And what did the smaller farmers do? They went back and tore theirs up. So we literally had a tobacco war based right away on the fact that equity was not part of the system and there were no regulations to provide equity. Hudson Valley, northeast United States, we have another situation in which we have large landowners, again, who are not working their land by themselves, of course, but they are using mostly indentured servants. And part of an indenture, of course, were people who paid for their passage from Europe to the Americas by working a certain number of years. It was often 7. The vast majority of them never lived to see the end of their 7 years of indenture because they died early from overwork, disease, malnutrition, and other maladies. And so there was no incentive whatsoever for the people who purchased their indentures to go easy on them because they died so often that it made no difference to them. So they were healthiest when they first arrived, so they worked them to death literally. And the promise at the end of those indentures was about 40 acres of land. And so the next big farm rebellion that I'm mentioning today has to do with the lack of that promise. You have people who are in control, who have mastery over individuals, who are expecting an outcome, and those large landowners did not even meet the promise of providing those 40 acres. If somebody worked their full indenture off, they still didn't even want to give them the 40 acres. Well, you can imagine how that went over. And so you had again a farm revolt on a massive scale.
That wasn't the Shays Rebellion.
Nope, get to the Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion, and that's my last one, in which after the American Revolution, it's no longer, American farmers no longer have a special relationship to England in terms of selling their products, and so the merchants in England are requiring cash money for what they send over. Those merchants then have to require cash money from the farmers that they deal with, and farmers don't have any. And they've been paying their bills off in kind for about a couple of centuries by that point. They're paying it off in labor or in agricultural products and other means. And so not having cash money, they're completely strapped. And so what happens is the merchants take them to prison. They can be convicted for debt. And the jails start filling up with people who are in debt, not allowed to work their farms, and have their farms essentially confiscated by larger landowners nearby. They're condemned upon to help pay their debts. And so this basically coincides at this moment with a political system in which all of the judgeships, all the sheriffs, all of the people in the state legislatures and the local county bailiff's offices, all of them are property landed gentry. And so there is no respite, there is no succor, there is no place for the average farmer to turn. And this is the foundation of the Shays Rebellion, going back to our original principles. This included lawyers, by the way, who were helping to put farmers into jail, and who executed highly unjust laws against them, and bankers who supported the moneyed interests of the nation, and the elites who held all of these interests. These are men of wealth, all white, of course. Not surprisingly, when farm protests grew violent, their targets were these courts. And we still have plenty of evidence of how violent those became, dragging the sheriff out and destroying the courts and literally physically tearing apart the building. Maybe this is the beginning of not allowing bankers and farmers into the National Farmers Union. It goes back that far. Okay, and what I want to make a point about is they were not seeking to disown or disqualify large landowners from the property that they owned legally. That was not their motion, that was not their action. They were simply trying to prevent elites, moneyed elites, from taking theirs. So what little they had, they wanted to hang on to. They were completely fine with them keeping what they had. So fast forward to the 1870s. Between the War of 1812 and the 1870s, essentially we call this the farmer's age. And so there's nothing to quell farm protest and violence like prosperity. In 1850 to 1870 in general, and there's always times where it's not going to work out very well for certain individuals in certain places, but in general, this is a period of expansion that the United States has never seen before. And this is where Kansas becomes Kansas, and Nebraska, and all of the other different places that we now consider to be the breadbasket of the country. This is where this comes from, including the California Valley and all of the other places that the Palouse in the Northwest. There seems to be no end to the prosperity that farmers can have, and the kind of technology that's becoming more and more available to them. But in 1872, the whole thing comes crashing to a halt. We have a massive, major recession, very similar to the stock market crash of 1929. And the Grange comes out of that crisis. Oliver Kelly, we all know about him. And that crisis was fueled by high taxes on farmers and high interest rates, again, that they could not meet. And the problem, of course, is that while roughly 1/2 of the United States population was directly involved in farm production and food production, only 7% of Congress was. So you start to see the growing disconnect between people who are running the country, no different than the Shays Rebellion, the people who are running the country and the people who are actually running the agricultural sector of the country. This led farmers to do their best to cut out the influence of that property class. And this led to cooperation in purchasing and in marketing, in self-community lending, and especially resistance to railroad monopolies, at which point this was a massive problem in terms of transportation and communication, telegraph as well. They openly admitted women, the Grange, but not free blacks. This was reflected later in the nativism of the populist platform, which I'll talk about just briefly, and created a deadly fissure which ended the 1892 bid for the presidential election that we all know William Jennings Bryan lost. So, how did this work out for farmers after the 1892 election, in which they lose and essentially their third-party bid is denied to them? Well, the cooperative movement takes off. It becomes the only successful portion of that populist moment. The political option is fairly dead, except at a very local level. But it's not going to work in a national context anymore. And so I found this great motto that from the Farmers Alliance, which I thought really explained things very well. They said, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. And this becomes the description of the difficulty that farm movements have in affecting change nationally. All farmers are living in two places at the same time. They have their feet in two places all the time. They have a foot in cooperative behavior, which the NFU and KFU is the direct descendant of, and I completely support, but they also have their foot in that liberty side, that side of the entrepreneurial individual, wanting to get ahead, willing to both cooperate and compete with their neighbor. And they adopted the joint stock structure of cooperatives, which became very, very successful. And I think everybody here is already very familiar with the way cooperatives work. So this led to that third-party movement, and third-party politics meant alliances with working people. It meant alliances especially with railroad workers, and it also led to that tension that I talked about. And the populist platform, if you read it today, and I read it to my students, they study it, and they're just overwhelmed by the prescience of the populist platform. The three main headings, of course, are money, necessities, and land. Very succinct. They wanted more circulation of money. Obviously, you go all the way back to the beginning of the colonial era. Not having access to capital was a primary issue for farmers and farm movements throughout history. Just like you explained today, Don, in your example in Montana. Necessities. Transportation and communication industry should be regulated and nationalized. This was a primary point of the populace. Land should be dispensed to willing settlers and fairly negotiated. Related issues, most of which have come to pass: the direct election of senators, women's suffrage, initiative and referendum at the local level, the regulation of railroad and telegraph companies, better support for farmers through the United States Department of Agriculture, better rural education, better roads, the restoration of the vote to African Americans, public works programs for the unemployed, national banking reforms, and pure food laws. Not a bad platform for 1892. Thank you for that. Okay. So, what is the legacy of all of that rabble-rousing for today that can help us understand better to reach people today and put together a more progressive farm bill and a more progressive rural society? I'm skipping ahead because I'm taking too much time. I'm not taking too much time. I'm gonna just say right out loud here that the Farm Bureau was never a reform movement. Has never been a reform movement, never will be a reform movement. It never had any principles. Not gonna get me into trouble on this podcast? I don't know. It basically arose from the farm bloc, as we know, Democratic and Republican senators working together, and rose from the ashes of a major recession. And it has never been a farm movement. It is a highly efficient, profit-driven business and education bureaucracy. And so it is not a reform movement. It has always been it has always had the backing of the wealthy elites, including banks, and absentee landowners, of course, and international investors, and the insurance industry. There is no central core of principle for the Farm Bureau. I defy you to tell me one, outside of we're going to make you rich, or we're going to make you wealthier, and we're going to sell you insurance. It is a quest for greater efficiency and size, and it has enjoyed the support, sadly, of most of the land-grant schools across the country. Return prosperity after World War II, again, made it a little easier to put aside reform movement and radical behavior. That is until the 1970s. And having not been able to pass a government-backed plan for national storage and distribution, which was known as the McNary-Hagan Plan, which was put together by the Farmers Alliance and by the remnants of the Populist Party in the 1920s. Everybody familiar with the McNary-Hagan Plan?
I am.
All right, would you like to? He doesn't count.
No, he doesn't.
I have a ringer in my audience. He's getting an A, he knows it. So the point is that the McNary-Hagan Plan essentially was a national program of storage and distribution. How many of you are familiar with the Wheat Board of Canada? All right, we have a few people who don't understand the Wheat Board. This is where the federal government acts as your distributor. They act as the middleman. They create the storage for your crops. You get a check, essentially, for the value of your crops on a rolling average basis. So if wheat on a rolling average basis is $2.25 a bushel, you get a check at the depot right there for all of the wheat crop that you get to take that home. If the federal government sells that wheat at $2.50, you get a second check. It's always 2 checks a year. If the wheat prices fall below $2.25, there's an insurance pool, essentially, that everybody puts into, a little penny or two per bushel that they put into an insurance pool, and you don't get your second check, but you don't have to pay a bill either. And over time, what that does is it levels out the ups and downs of crop prices. And that was the McNary-Hagan bill. It was passed 3 times by Congress. 3 times, and was vetoed by the president 3 times. The last time really didn't matter because it landed on his desk on Black Friday, and all bets were off. Okay, so by the 1980s, we are living in a world without a McNary-Hagan Plan. We don't have a central distribution, and all the levers of power are more or less intact. The same ones that made Shays' Rebellion so difficult and all of the other farm protests possible. So now we're in familiar territory, and I don't even need to tell this group about the farm crisis in the 1980s. Most of you lived it. Most of you are still watching the repercussions of it. When I started teaching at K-State, when I started teaching ag history, 90% of the students in my classes were from farm families, and more than half of them their farm families had lost their property already, or they were in foreclosure, or they were in the last spirals of trying to hang on to their family ground. And most of those young people wanted to go back, but there was literally nothing to go back to. And it was a very depressing time to be teaching those young people. So let's fast forward to this moment, and how the hell then do we explain Trump? I'm happy to talk about it. I'm leaving. I'm retiring in July. Fire me. So, here is my thesis. Setting partisan politics to the side for a little moment, Trump is not as surprising a phenomenon as it seems, not when you put it into this context. Think that farmers voting for Trump did so in much the same way the colonial farmers attacked their legal and moneyed interests. Consider that in response to an entrenched system that they felt was unfair, and frankly has been unfair. Who is this system today? They are convinced it is the political elite of both parties. And voting for Trump was a disruption. It was a form of political violence, of upending the system that they felt had never worked for them. And from the moment that Ronald Reagan was elected and said, the 7 deadliest words in American history are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, or he said, greed is good, at that moment, the political and moneyed elites became the bugaboo for people living in rural America. And they didn't have any trust for those people at all. And so moving in the direction, setting aside all of the moral hypocrisy of voting for someone like Trump, voters could see, imperfectly, but they could see the alliance of politics and capitalism. They could see the long entwined relationship. They could see the huge yawning gulf between the haves and the have-nots. And much like earlier farm protesters, they too have always had one foot in both worlds. The anti-government world that requires collective resistance, and the capitalist independent one that says, I can be wealthy too. Just like that guy. If that guy on TV can do it, I can do it. Delusional? Yes. Unprecedented? No. What's the big difference then between the populists of today at these Trump rallies, being violent, pushing people around, yelling, being on the outside, and the populists of the 1892 platform and before? Well, the big one is that the so-called populist, Trump populism of today, they have no policies. They have no principles. They have no motive. They have only emotion, and that emotion is hate and fear. What the populism of today has successfully channeled that anger and fear in a highly plastic way that fits all circumstances, all of their original prejudices against women, against blacks, against Latinx, against immigrants, against professors, against communists, against LGBTQ, against atheists. The list is very, very long. It's a great menu to choose from. And noticeably, it does not include Russia. And has distracted enough people to become an historical force in itself. It is radical and it is populist, that is, it is anti-state, but it is not a farm movement. And I hope I can make that clear that it's not in the same tradition as the farm movement. So my ideas for the future of a true progressive movement, am I too long now? Too done? Nope. Acknowledge the anger. You have to acknowledge the anger. This is real. It is based in fear, it is not well informed, and it is often extremely offensive to us, but it is real. Number 2 is to reach out to your natural allies, folks who share those 4 principles. Getting out the vote, expanding the franchise, looking for equity. Most of all, those who are for campaign finance reform and a greater control over corporate welfare ought to be your natural allies, regardless of whether or not they're part of the farm sector. This is what gave the original populists their strength. It also is what brought them down when they weren't able to reach out far enough. Reach out to the migrant farm population. In this country today, that means the Latinx people. It used to be Black people. It used to be former slaves. And the racial divide between farm workers and farm landowners ended up being disastrous for both, and opened the door for their exploitation for the next century. Stand up for secularism. I know it's going to sound surprising, but stand up for secularism. The growing majority of young people are not affiliated with religion. Okay, boomer. They will likely return to their spiritual roots when they get older. But right now, that lack of religious affiliation should not be taken as a weakness in their strong desire for a more people-oriented social order. It is a natural alliance of groups like the NFU together with those young people. They are also mad. Acknowledge that. Thank you.